Hello everybody, welcome to a brand new episode of the 5 Red Lights. Today we are discussing what happened at the Bahrain Grand Prix, the season opener for the 2021 season. Let's get into this. My name's Aaron and it's time for the 5 Red Lights.
1 light, 2 lights, 3 lights, 4 lights, 5 lights, and it's go, 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 go!
Oh boy, what a race. That was absolutely sensational. I'd actually argue that this is the best race of the entire V6 Turbo Hybrid era. It just had everything, didn't it? We had crashes, we had drama, we had strategy at play. It was like a game of chess at some points in the opening stages. We had a little bit of controversy with Verstappen having to give the place back and the track limits at turn 4. And we had a battle for the lead that went down to the last corner of the last lap. It was everything that Formula One should be and wants to be from 2022 onwards. It was just an outstanding Grand Prix. Now, Bahrain has produced some superb races, especially since it went to a nighttime event. The 2006 running during the day was quite a good race, actually. If you go back and watch it on F1 TV, that is a very enjoyable watch. The battle between Schumacher and Alonso, Renault versus Ferrari, again a season opener. But this one, it was on a level of the 2014 race where Mercedes had the dominant car with Hamilton and Rosberg, and when they were allowed to just go at it, it was absolutely scintillating. And again today we were treated. It was like Christmas, you know. And I woke up this morning and I thought, this is like a Christmas day, isn't it? You're waiting and waiting and waiting for the big moment. And it's like the build up to Christmas, isn't it? That countdown, the days before, getting everything ready. So, you know, you get up. The clocks went forward this morning as well. So I thought, oh, great, that's an hour less that I have to wait. But in fact, it made the waiting even more excruciating. So luckily we had the Formula 2 race to enjoy, which was fantastic as well, I might add. And then we were treated to a superb season opener. Obviously, I likened it to the 2014 Grand Prix in Bahrain, but the only other race I can potentially liken it to, because the order about halfway through, I was looking at it and thinking, well, how have they ended up there? They were up there a minute ago. The 2003 Australian Grand Prix. Now, I know some people who watch this might be possibly a touch too young to have watched that before. Actually, one of my favourite races, because it's generally a very exciting race, and it was won by one of my favourite drivers, David Coulthard, his final Grand Prix win, in fact. But there's a comment that Martin Brundle on the commentary makes at the end of that race. He says, at the halfway point, we had no idea who was going to win. And today was exactly the same. We didn't know whether Bottas was going to come through and usurp Hamilton and Verstappen from third place. We didn't know how the strategy was going to play out between Hamilton and Verstappen, because they were having a game of chess and Bottas was kind of the one doing something completely different to both of them. So we didn't know whose strategy was going to play out best there for the victory. There was an almighty scrap in the midfield where every time you looked at the running order on the left-hand side of the screen, people were in a completely different order than the last time you looked. So there was just so much going on, and you add to that the cars were side by side an awful lot, and we had the clever little box on the left hand side kept popping up, usually for Sergio Perez going past someone else. But it was really, really so exciting. It had me on the edge of my seat right at the end. At the very beginning, it was a very chaotic race, but we settled down, and then the pit stops happened, and that threw everything back up in the air again. And it was just constantly, everything's going up in the air, being whirled around, and you're waiting for everything to settle down. And then it did. And we were confronted with a showdown, finally, a proper showdown between Lewis Hamilton, the 7 times world champion, 95 times a Grand Prix race winner, versus Max Verstappen, the king in waiting. And boy, were we treated to something special. Lewis came out on top, but as Martin Brundle, again, I'll pick out his commentary. He has very clever ways of summing these races up. It was a familiar podium, but the way we got there was so much more fun. It was just a fantastic Grand Prix. And for me, it is possibly and arguably the best race of the turbo hybrid era. If you disagree, chuck it in the comments down below and let's have a debate. So let's get on to the Hamilton and Verstappen battle. The battle lines have been drawn. It's what we've all been waiting for, isn't it? The showdown between the undisputed king and now he has a challenger. Vettel was there. He was the potential usurper a few years ago, but he has been dispatched. Now he's at Aston Martin, and he didn't actually have that great a weekend this weekend, unfortunately for him, on his debut for Aston Martin. But Verstappen versus Hamilton, the experienced hand, and it seems so strange now calling Lewis Hamilton the experienced driver, having followed his career all the way through. And Max Verstappen, as I said before, the king in waiting. We got down to the point of about 15 laps to go. The gap's just over 5 seconds. Verstappen is on 10 lap younger tyres, harder tyres. Hamilton has been on his hard tyres since about lap 36, 37, I believe. Now, this is where Lewis Hamilton has made himself irreplaceable with this final 15 laps. But let's just have a quick look at how he got there. He managed to keep himself in that 2-second gap to go for the undercut in the early stages. Mercedes pulled the pin, and it worked. They forced Red Bull into a strategy they all say they wanted to do, but I don't think Red Bull would have wanted it to be that way. They would have been wanting to dictate strategy. They would have been wanting to be the ones getting in first, having built a nice enough gap. But Mercedes pulled the plug and they went for it. And it got them track position. So 15 laps to go. We've got Bottas out of the equation after his mishap in the pit lane with the wheel not coming off. And it's just Hamilton versus Verstappen. Perez suffered his issues on the parade lap, and he was out of the equation too. Verstappen closing in the gap was an issue for me. He was taking enough time out of Hamilton. He was closing the gap, but he wasn't closing it quick enough. Why take the risk of something unforeseen happening, which, as we'll get to, the incident was, you don't expect to have to give the place back. He's closing in at almost a second a lap at times, somewhere between half a second, 3/4 of a second of a lap, sometimes closer to a second. Could he have gone a bit faster? Could Red Bull have taken the bull, forgive the pun, the bull by the horns, and just put Hamilton under immense pressure? If Verstappen comes at him like a torpedo, Hamilton has a decision to make. Pick up his pace or settle for second. Because, as we saw, Hamilton didn't have a car that was handling perfectly, especially when he went into turn 10. He ran wide and presented Verstappen with the opportunity to make the pass. Now, given that mistake, and Verstappen, when he did get there, he had 4 or 5 laps left to make that move. He would have expected to have got the job done pretty much immediately, perhaps even down the main straight. But Hamilton was really clever. Waited until the last possible second to move across and cover the inside. And he actually forced Verstappen to go to the outside. Because I think if that was Ricciardo, he would have gone down the inside on the brakes. And I think if it was later in the season and there wasn't a championship battle, Verstappen would have done the same thing. And this is already the psychology at play for me. Verstappen knows he needs to get the win. But he also knows that getting second place is an important first step of the championship. If you go barreling down the inside, get it wrong, pick up a puncture, spin out, lose a front wing, that could be disastrous. You could end up with nil points at the opening race. So he had to think. He made the decision to go on the outside, set himself up for turn 4. Now, I thought Hamilton might have been able to catch the DRS from Giovinazzi, who was ahead of him being lapped. He didn't, but he still made a superb defensive manoeuvre despite Verstappen going around the outside of him. Now, we've seen Hamilton tip a Red Bull off when the Red Bull's been going around the outside of him before, but it wasn't Albon in the seat this time. It was Verstappen, so there was no question of Hamilton driving him off the road. But what Hamilton was able to do was to again force Verstappen to go to the outside, even though that is the favoured racing line, and put Verstappen in a position where he's got to risk going off the track and going across those track limits. I'm not going to get too much into the track limits because at the end of the day, I have absolutely no control over what the FIA say is yes and say is no for track limits. We can only deal with what they say, and if what they say is complete and utter garbage, then we're going to have situations like this. But in the end, it did kind of make for a very exciting racing. Ironically, Red Bull kind of flagged what Mercedes were doing with Hamilton, or allowing Hamilton to do, and then they kind of put themselves into that corner when it happened. Although I think even without it, they would have been flagged for it anyway. So Verstappen gets that little touch of oversteer as he goes round the outside of Hamilton, goes wide, and Mike Brundle again raises a really good point. Could Verstappen have chosen a better place to give the position back? I think they were so concerned with getting a penalty that they kind of asked him to do it, do it right now. Just do it now. His tyres will die off and we've got the speed. But I think Red Bull showed their rustiness, I would say, in being in a race-winning championship position sort of dogfight. And it meant that they forgot to play the game, basically. They forgot to put Hamilton into a position where, okay, you can have the place back, but we're going to nail you at the very first opportunity. Could Verstappen have done it on the main straight, or even on the penultimate straight going into turn 14? Because then Hamilton would have been forced to follow through the long corners leading onto that straight, and that would have wrecked his tyres that little bit more, giving Verstappen even more of an advantage. He didn't, and ultimately it was Verstappen who got all out of shape into turn 13, which meant his tyres got too hot, and then he wasn't close enough to make use of the DRS. From there, Verstappen wasn't able to close, wasn't able to get back onto the rear wing of Hamilton, and Hamilton is simply a master of defensive driving. Some will say he's never really been challenged over the last couple of seasons, but when it comes down to it, if you look at the 2018 Italian Grand Prix, you look at today's Grand Prix, attacking and defending, there is no one better at both. I'm not saying that there is someone who there isn't anyone better at attacking driving than Hamilton. There's probably very, very few, if any. And defensive driving, again, probably very few. But to be as close on both at such a high level, no one better for me. If I want someone who's going to look after the car, Hamilton's the man at the moment. Now, don't get me wrong, Verstappen is an excellent driver, but he's still very young. And very similar to Hamilton, he's got to go through that learning process. Hamilton was thrown in at the deep end. he had to learn fast. Verstappen's had a little bit of time to get used to these sort of concepts and to hone his skills, although I don't think he's always gone about it in that way. So ultimately Verstappen failed in his bid to win the opening race. Hamilton is irreplaceable. I asked the question on Twitter, how do Mercedes replace this guy? You can't. It just won't happen. It's not doable. They've got George Russell in the wings. They might even buy out Max Verstappen. But how do you replace a guy of this quality? On my notes, I'll just read you what I've put down. The top drivers win the races they should win. And this is a race that Max Verstappen should have won. He's a top driver. One of the best in the field at the moment today. Whether he'll be up there with the pantheon of greats is another question. We'll have to wait and see over time. But the top drivers, they win the races that they should win. The very best: Hamilton, Schumacher, Senna, Prost, Fangio, Jackie Stewart, Jim Clark. I could keep going, but I'll stop there. They win the races that they shouldn't win. For Hamilton, it was Bahrain 2021. It was Turkey 2020. And there have been a few other races as well for Lewis. But that is where the very best, the champions, make the difference. Verstappen himself said this after the Sakir Grand Prix last year. Hamilton makes the difference. When you need 3/10 to be found on a qualifying lap, Hamilton is the man to find it. It's not Bottas. Bottas doesn't find 3/10 to beat Red Bull to pole. Hamilton does. If you need someone to take the fight to another team, to Ferrari, and make the overtakes that stick to win you the race, Hamilton does those overtakes. If you think back to the 2018 Italian Grand Prix, Hamilton was the man passing Kimi Raikkonen. Okay, Bottas held him up a little bit, but Hamilton put himself in a position where Mercedes could execute the strategy to give him a winning opportunity. In 2019, Hamilton couldn't get past Charles Leclerc, but Bottas had fresher tyres, closed the gap, and still really couldn't put up much of a challenge to the Ferrari, who was on older tyres. And therein lies the difference. Top drivers win the races they should win. The best drivers win those that they shouldn't by taking opportunities by the scruff of the neck and never ever letting it go. Verstappen is on his way to being one of the very best. But he does need to be the top driver. He needs to be winning those races. And today was one of those. It slipped through his fingers. Unfortunately for him, it's a race win lost. But all is not over. It's the first round of 23 races. And if we've got 22 races left, and if we get half of them that are as good as this, then we are in for an absolutely spellbinding season of Formula One. Let's talk a little bit briefly about Valtteri Bottas, Lewis Hamilton's teammate, or wingman, as some people may describe him, because already, even though there was a few things out of his control, he's very quickly heading towards that wingman status, because he finished 37 seconds off the lead. If you take away the 23 for the pit stop, which he went for the fastest lap on, it equates to about 14 seconds. Okay, take away 10 seconds of the pit stop, well, 8 seconds on the pit stop. Still about 6 seconds behind, isn't it? He needs to be snapping at the heels of Hamilton if he wants to win the World Championship. I think he may have been able to, if the pit stop hadn't had the issue, he would have put the pressure on Verstappen. The outcome would have been very different. And Bottas may have been in a better position to challenge. But in the early stages, he'd already dropped to almost 7 seconds off the lead, because he'd got stuck behind Leclerc after a poor start. He started from the good side of the grid and he had managed to allow Leclerc to get through on the opening sequence of corners. Bottas needs to tidy that up. He has far too many occasions where he drops back at the start and has to fight his way back through. And last year, that killed his opportunity to win the World Championship. Because if he'd been able to stay at the front with Hamilton, he could have put him under a bit of pressure, forced a mistake, but Hamilton was able to get into a groove, have it all too easy out front. Not that it is completely easy at the front. You have to keep your concentration, hit your apexes, and make absolutely no mistakes. So the pressure is already heaping on top of Bottas. Mr. Selfish this season. Okay, it's one race. Let's not all jump on him immediately. But if you want to be world champion, you have to hold yourself to very high standards, and he cannot be pleased with P3 for me. He has to be fuming about that and come out swinging at Imola, where of course he took pole position and was leading for much of the opening stages last year. Let's talk about the Red Bull team and their second driver, Sergio Perez. He had an eventful day. He qualified 11th on the grid. Then he had power failure on the formation lap, which was quite bizarre. Didn't get out of the car, managed to get it going again, and started from the pit lane. His pace was superb throughout, and he was slicing his way through the field. That Honda power unit has really improved. It's beyond what it was in 2020. At least it may even be the strongest in the field this year, which, 3-4 years ago, if you'd said Honda are going to have the strongest power unit on the grid, whoever had said that to you, you'd have laughed in their face. But that could be the reality right now. Mercedes have got a little bit of work to do, especially on the ERS and recovery side, I think. But the Red Bull is a much better car this year. It's moving through the field nicely, and in dirty air, it seems to be able to cope. And it's quick out front as well. Verstappen proved that. So for Perez, it was actually a very decent opening race, considering all the problems that he'd had over the weekend and missing out on Q3 and then the power failure and having to start from the pit lane. The irony of all of that is, as the brothers Hunt pointed out, is that Perez stopping on the formation lap meant they had to do the extra formation lap, which took a lap away from the overall race distance, and that was one lap that Max Verstappen could have used to make the pass for victory again. Would he have made it? We'll never know. But ultimately, it's a touch ironic that ended up shooting Red Bull in the foot with the other car. What could Sergio have achieved from 11th on the grid? For me, I think he'd have been on the podium. He would have beaten Bottas because Bottas had the slow stop. And if he'd qualified in the top 10, he'd probably almost certainly been in the top 6 at least, because Charles Leclerc pulled out an amazing qualifying lap. Where would he have been from there? Could he have battled for the victory even? That would have been something quite incredible. But for Sergio, a superb recovery. He seems to like a recovery drive in Bahrain. And a solid start. 10 points out of 5th place. That'll give him some confidence having fought back through the field. So just to close off my thoughts on this weekend's Grand Prix, a few other standout drivers for me. I've got 3 of them here, so I'm going to start with Lando Norris. He battled Daniel Ricciardo, who he'd qualified behind on the grid and in the good early stages, wheel to wheel with his new teammate, and it was all fair. It was good, and he got himself ahead, secured the position, and once he'd stopped first of those sort of leading cars after Alonso had pitted and sort of pulled the plug on all the pit stops going, Lando kind of took off. He went into rocket ship mode and tore off up the road into 4th place, which at one point became 3rd when Bottas had the sloppy pit stop. And he actually pulled off 2 brilliant overtakes. Well, one brilliant overtake and one almost brilliant overtake before making an easy one with DRS. The first one was on Gasly, ran the outside at the restart from I think it was the full safety car. before the VSC. Yeah, it would have been before the VSC, wouldn't it? Because Gasly helped cause the VSC. And then at the start of after the VSC, he had a run on Leclerc and almost made that stick, but then did him with the DRS on the main straight at the start of the next lap. From there, he picked up a really good pace, got in a good groove, comfortable to Charles Leclerc throughout the race, never really under pressure from the Ferrari, and had enough in hand to hang on from Sergio Perez's late charge towards the end. My second standout driver is Charles Leclerc, a brilliant qualifying lap, getting himself fourth on the grid. Again, it probably went kind of unnoticed given the battle at the front. And again, good pace through the race. Held on a top 5 position for the majority of it. Got caught by Perez late on, but Perez had fresher tyres and a faster car. But for Charles, that is proof that Ferrari have made a good step. Ferrari scored points with both cars in the opening race. So they've made good steps on the engine. They've made a good step with the car, the chassis. So things are looking much brighter for the Scuderia. And my last standout driver is Yuki Sonoda, the little Japanese driver. He was the debutant who kept it pointing the right way. Steady progress. He fluctuated up and down the order a little bit, but towards the end he was one of the guys on the move. Steadily came through the pack for 9th place, 2 points on debut, and he can be very, very pleased with that. He had a bit of a Larry moment behind Kimi Raikkonen down into turn 1 and did really well to hold onto the car and keep it pointing in a straight line. So they are my 3 standout drivers outside of those who I'd mentioned before. Well, that is all for today. So before we finish, if you're new around here and you enjoy what you're seeing, leave a like, subscribe. If this is the first time you are viewing the channel, have a look at some of the other videos that I have put out in pre-season. And I want to know, as I said before, whether you think this was the best Grand Prix of the turbo hybrid era. And if you disagree, chuck in a few suggestions for some other contenders. Let's have a good debate about that. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next episode. My name's Aaron. This has been the 5 Red Lights. When the 5 red lights go out, I'll see you next time. Bye for now, guys.